All right. Good morning. How are we? Great. You guys can hear me clearly. I can hear myself. So I sound pretty loud. I'll tone it down. So glad to be here with you guys on a Sunday morning. I always say this. It's a privilege for me to be here. I don't want to take this for granted. And I thank all of us for coming out on a Sunday morning. We're coming out here because I hope we're expecting to hear from God, and that's what we're going to be doing this morning. Just to set things up, the next 40 minutes that we're going to be spending together, just for me to kind of give you an idea of where we're going. Last week we finished the series on angels and demons. Okay, we heard the last sermon about the devil and spiritual warfare, and now we're going to be changing gears. We're going to be having a few weeks for standalone meetings, and then we're going to be jumping into another series. So just want to orient all of us to where we're at. Okay, this morning I want to share with us an idea, a key concept that we see in the Scripture. I want to give us a biblical passage that displays that idea, and then I want to talk about some examples of what this idea looks like for you and for me. And it's focused around this one question. It's, I think, a question that maybe many Christians, even here this morning, might struggle with. I know that I do on a regular basis. And the question is, how is it that the gospel works itself into our everyday lives? We get it for Sunday morning. We're here on a Sunday morning. We come to church and we understand the gospel and we sing the songs. But what about Monday through Saturday? What happens when we have to wake up tomorrow? For me, it's 6 a.m. I get my coffee, probably eat my breakfast at work, so I skip the traffic. What happens then? How does the gospel work itself into my life then? How does it influence my life? How does it impact my life in a practical way Monday through Saturday? I think it's something that we sometimes struggle with. I've been doing this online course. It's an online course that I've been working through, and I've got to write a paper on secular humanism, okay? I know, fascinating, so exciting. I actually haven't started. I have to start soon, so I'm reminding myself that I have to start. But I've got this big paper that I got to write, secular humanism, and part of my research, I was on YouTube, and you know how research works nowadays. You Google it or you YouTube it, right? And that's how you learn everything. Definitely not how I'm writing my paper, just saying. But I went on and I just kind of put in YouTube secular humanism. And I saw this video of this kind of influential secular humanist. And for those of us that maybe don't know, secular humanism is just the idea that humanity, people, can find happiness, can find fulfillment, can even find eternal life only with looking at ourselves, within humanity. Whether a God exists or doesn't exist is not the point. Forget about God, forget about religion. We need to focus on what we can handle as humans. That's secular humanism, okay? And so this guy comes up and he starts talking, and it's a little bit strange because it's a sermon. That's what it is. He's preaching to this room of secular humanists about why secular humanism is the superior way of thinking, the way of life. And he gets up there and he comes from a unique perspective. Why? Because according to him, he used to be a Christian. And he tells his testimony. He said, I used to come to church about 17, 18 years old. I was a good kid. Okay, I didn't smoke weed. I didn't beat up on kids after school. I was good. I would actually include people, and I would reach out to people at school, but I wasn't a Christian. Until one guy invited me to a youth group, and I went to this youth group, and it was great. I loved it. Everyone was so nice. There was a lot of Christians there, and they were just so nice. And they pulled me into their group. Even though I wasn't a Christian, they included me. And this was a big deal for me because I had never been included in that kind of way. And so I started to be part of this whole church Christianity thing, and then he continues, and he says, but you know what? I never really believed in God. I love church, I love Christianity because they told you all these great things and you could be part of this great community on Sunday morning, Friday night, youth group thing. But me personally, I never really came to believe in God. I never believed the gospel. And then he continues and he says, and then it kind of dawned on me one day. I can have community. I can be socially fulfilled without having to believe in all the things that Christians believe, with all the dogmas. I can avoid all that. We as secular humanists, he's saying we can just come together and we can have church, if you will, and leave all the crazy God stuff, Bible stuff out, right? We make life easier for ourselves. And then he continues, and he said something interesting that really caught my eye. He said, and I think he's wrong, let me just say this, I think he's wrong. But he said, my theory is that most Christians just come to church, most Christians are really just involved in Christianity because it gives them a place to belong. It gives them a social context where they can meet nice people, where their kids can make friends, where they have somewhere to go on a Sunday morning, where they have friends. Now, I don't think he's right. I don't think most Christians just come to church because part of Christianity because they have this social construct that they need for themselves. I don't think that's true. But I think some of it is true. And I think the mistake that he made is that he saw Christianity and he reduced it to a bunch of social things that he had to do. And he missed out on the gospel. He missed out on the heart of what Christianity was about. He missed out on who Jesus Christ is, what Christ did on the cross for him. He never believed that. He never even believed in God. And that's kind of interesting to me, that we can make that kind of a distinction. And I think he failed to answer that question. The secular humanist, he failed to answer the question about how Christianity, how the gospel, how who Jesus is and who God is, how that impacts him on a daily level. Because for him, the answer was in no way. It does not. And yet that's not what we get in the Bible. What we get in the Bible is the clear message of the gospel, and that gospel influencing our lives in a very practical, very clear, tangible way. So that's our question for today. Why? Or rather, how? How is it that the gospel influences our life? If we don't understand how the gospel works itself into our life, ultimately Christianity is just reduced to an intellectual hobby or a social hobby, which is what happened with the secular humanist. He didn't get the gospel. He didn't embrace it. It didn't impact his life. And so this church, Sunday morning, became nothing more than a social idea for him. Just something he kind of participated in so that he could have friends. That's why this question is important. How does the gospel work itself into your life and my life? It's a big question. I don't think we'll answer all of it today, but I think we can start on our way to answering it. And I think the Bible gives us a really clear example of how this happens. I use the word gospel in a very clear way, right? Some of us might think to ourselves about the question, how is it that the gospel works itself into our life? And we say, well, it's the Bible has commandments, right? Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. Love God above all other things. That's it. That's how the gospel, that's how Christianity impacts our daily life. And although I would say, yes, that is how the gospel influences or impacts our daily life, I don't think that's all of it. Because we can do all of those things and still miss out on the heart of God. Remember the secular humanist. He was a good person. He loved other people like he loved himself. He went to church. He didn't murder. He did not commit adultery. And he fulfilled all of these biblical commandments, but he missed out on the heart of God. He missed out on the gospel. And so although the answer is yes, the way that the gospel works itself into our life is through the commandments of the Bible, it's more than that. Remember the Pharisees. This blows my mind. Jesus' harshest words said on earth were said to people who had a shallow moralism but did not have any real love for God. That's who the Pharisees are. Do you catch that? Jesus' harshest words were said to religious people who had a shallow sense of moralism with no real love for God. The Pharisees missed the whole point. And they when it came to the law, when it came to the commandments, they were spotless. I mean, people admired the Pharisees, and yet they missed the whole point. So when we ask ourselves the question, how is it that the gospel works itself into our life? It's got to be more than just following commandments. There's something deeper going on that aims us, that leads us into the heart of God about the gospel. When we talk about the gospel, I want to be clear. I'm talking about the good news. That's what the word gospel means in Greek. It's a Greek word that we kind of transliterate to English. It means good news. What good news? There's a lot of good news out there, right? Well, it's the good news that God has come on this earth and has come to redeem us from the penalty and punishment of sin. When we think about gospel, we think normally about Jesus Christ dying on the cross for our sins and then coming back from the dead so that we could have new life in him. The gospel is it's the good news of God's redemptive work on earth. And if we're to live as Christians, it has to be focused around this gospel. That's the foundation. That's where we start. That's where Christians are born. It's when God says that he begins a redemptive work in our plan, right? And we know that that starts with faith, like Jesus was explaining to Nicodemus. If we believe in God and we believe that what God has done on the cross is indeed enough to save us from the penalty and the punishment of sin, then we become Christians, right? God begins that redemptive work in our life. Now, sometimes as Christians, we can think of the gospel as just the starting point. It's like the starting line of the Christian life. But then you get on with your Christian life and you move on beyond the gospel. And the gospel becomes very not relevant to our life beyond the beginning of our Christian life. And that's not the way the Bible speaks. You see, the gospel is not just the foundation of our Christian life, it's how we build our Christian life as well. We'll go into that a little bit later. I want us to think about the gospel in two ways. That's two ways. The first is what I'm going to call the cosmic gospel, okay? I'm not getting weird here, just follow me. Cosmic gospel, okay? It's the universal plan of God's redemption. And then there's the personal gospel, which is God's redemptive plan for you personally, okay? The cosmic plan goes something like this. God created a perfect universe. Everything was good. There was no sin on earth. And then he created Adam and Eve. And what did they do? If you went to Sunday school and you passed, they ate the fruit. And that introduced sin into the whole universe. And there was something fractured and perverse about sin. And that began to spread all around the earth. And it has been spreading since then. And slowly but surely, God has been redeeming a people, Israel, right? And out of Israel came Jesus Christ. And when he died on the cross, he began the universal redemptive process of God here on earth. God is bringing things back to how they should be. And we get a sneak peek, a teaser trailer to how the story ends in Revelations. Revelation ends when the entire universe is perfectly lined up with the way that God designed things to be. And that means you and that means me are also lined up. Cosmic gospel. God is redeeming the whole universe back to where it should be. And then there's the personal gospel, you and me. And for all of us, that gospel story, the testimony might be a little bit different. I was 6 years old. We were on our way to my grandmother's birthday party. And then the van breaks down. The true story. Okay, I'm not making this up. True story. Van breaks down. My dad has to stay and call for the tow truck. And the rest of my family goes off to enjoy dinner. I stay with my dad because that's what a guy likes to do. He likes to stay with his dad. And so I stayed with my dad, and he explained to me the gospel in a very simple way. And at 6 years old, I understood that I had done bad things. I understood that that had an eternal consequence and that Jesus Christ was the only one that could save me. And I prayed to receive Jesus Christ at that moment. I was 6. I remember it. I literally remember sitting in the parking lot of a gas station. That's my personal gospel. God has begun a redemptive work in every single Christian's life. It looks different, but God is doing something. He's working in our lives to bring us back into line with his design. He's redeeming us. Sometimes we think about Christianity as something that you start. It's like a club or like a status, right? Like a Facebook status where you change your status. You used to be agnostic or you used to be Catholic, and then you change your status and now you're a Christian, and that's it. You just kind of go on with your life. Your status is different. Well, that's not how the Bible thinks about the gospel. It's not how the Bible thinks about Christianity. There's something very intentional about the gospel. There's something that's very active about the gospel in your life and in my life. I love also how in the gospel, this is kind of a side point, but I think it's worth it. I love how in the gospel, all of the character of God is most visible in the gospel, okay? Here's what I mean by that. In the event of Jesus Christ dying on the cross and coming back from the dead, we see all of God's character most visible in the entire universe. You want to see where God is most loving? Look to Jesus Christ on the cross. You want to see where God is most graceful, where he's most merciful? Look to Jesus Christ on the cross. You want to see where God's justice is displayed? Look to the cross. You want to see where his wrath is displayed? Look to the cross. The cross, the gospel, is the apex of God revealing his character to the entire universe. It's not just where Christianity starts. It's where Christianity is founded upon and built up from. So how does the gospel work itself into our life? I think it does so in two ways, okay? First, I think that how the gospel has changed you and me gives us a new way of looking at reality. And the gospel informs us about these new realities that we look at, okay? Before the gospel, we used to think something about marriage. We used to think something about work, something about God, something about church, something about relationships, something about anger, about love. And yet when we became Christians, the transformation in our hearts was so impactful that the way that we see reality now changes. Marriage used to be two people just getting together, and it's better for the taxes, and it's easier to pay rent for one house instead of two, and so you just kind of get married, plus your parents want you to do it. You have some babies, and that's life. But now, in the gospel, because of what the gospel has done, marriage is something so much more beautiful, so much more intentional, so much more pure. It's something that God has instituted for people to rejoice in, to reflect the church. It's deeper. It's changed. That's the first way. And then the second way that I think the gospel works itself into our life is it also provides, I'm going to use the word template. It provides an example for how you and me ought to live. What does this mean? Well, when we ask ourselves, how should we show mercy to our fellow human? Look to the gospel. How has God shown mercy to you and to me? And if God has shown mercy to you and to me, that is how we should show mercy to others. How has God loved others? That is how we should love others as well. And so I think those are the two primary ways that the gospel works itself into our life. It helps us see the world in a new way, and it gives us an example to follow. So in short, the gospel helps us see things. The gospel helps us see things like God sees them, and it helps us do things like God does them. We see that in the gospel, okay? Now, is Jerry making this up? Is he going crazy? Is this whole idea of the gospel being the foundation, but also the thing built up, is this something that Jerry made up? The answer, I think, is no. We see a very clear example of that in the Bible. It's all over the place, okay? Where people in the Bible look at their life, they look at themselves, look at their mission, their purpose in life, and instead of looking at it in the way that the world sees it, they realize that the transformation in their life has been so significant, it's so impactful, that now the way they see reality has totally changed. I'm going to introduce to you guys this term just because I think it's helpful. But when we see the world the way that God sees it through the gospel, when we behave and do and obey God in a way that we see in the gospel, that's what we call being gospel-centered. Gospel-centered, okay? It's not a term that we see in the Bible, but it's a helpful term, gospel-centered. Okay. Now, I want to show you guys this great passage where we see this so clearly, and we can get a sense of what this might look like for your life and for my life. So let's turn to Philippians chapter 3. I think we're familiar with this passage, okay? It's a fairly common passage that we might read through several times, and yet I want us to see the way that Paul sees himself, all right? Philippians 3, chapter 3, verses 3 through 9. Just for a little bit of context, this is Philippians. Paul is writing this to the church in Philippi, and they were being attacked by false teachers. And these false teachers were basically saying that, yeah, if you want to be a Christian, believe the gospel, fine. But if you want to be a real Christian, you want to move up to the next level, you have to follow the law of Moses. Namely, you got to get circumcised. So the church of Philippi was confused. They're like, man, Paul told us that it was just the gospel, it was just faith, that we follow Jesus Christ, and nothing else needs to be added to that. But now we hear these other guys who seem to be really religious. I mean, they're Jewish, like Paul was Jewish, right? But they're telling us that we got to be circumcised. And I don't know what Paul has to say about this. So they wrote him, and Paul is writing back, okay? And this is Paul's response. I want us to see how the gospel shapes Paul's life, the way that Paul sees himself, the way that Paul values things. Okay, let's go. Philippians chapter 3, starting in verse 3, for we, talking about himself as a Jewish person, for we who worship by the Spirit of God, I'm sorry, hold on. Okay. For we are of the circumcision, who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh, okay? This is Paul. Here we go. Ready? Though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I more so. This is Paul's resume. I was circumcised on the 8th day, the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, I was blameless. Now look at verse 7. But whatever gain I had, I counted all as loss for the sake of Christ. Verse 8, indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. We're going to stop there. You guys catch the list that Paul shared with us about himself? It's an impressive list. He was circumcised, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews. He was a Pharisee. Pharisees had a lot of prestige in that culture, okay? They were teachers of the law. He had basically reached the pinnacle of his Jewish society. He was acing it. He was doing awesome in life. And on top of that, he was so passionate that they single-handedly charged Paul with persecuting those heretic Christians. Paul had his life set up. He had an incredible career. He was doing an amazing job. He was probably 30 around the time that he got converted. Paul actually studied under one of the most famous Pharisees of his day. He was a guy named Gamaliel. He was a genius, okay? And Paul was his personal prodigy. Paul's life was lined up. But then what happens? Acts chapter 9 is what happens. Paul is on his way to Damascus, and the gospel comes and crashes into Paul's life. God shows up. Jesus shows up and tells him, Paul, why are you persecuting me? There's an interaction between Paul and Jesus. Paul gets saved. Paul believes the gospel. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus did die on the cross for me, and this means that my sins are forgiven only because of what Jesus Christ has done, not because I'm a Jew, not because I'm good at following some rules. The gospel enters Paul's life. Now, I want to note, the things that Paul mentions about himself, these are not sinful things. Did you catch that? Paul is not saying, I used to smoke weed, and I used to go partying, and I used to cheat all the time, and I used to steal money from my job, but now I don't. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, I used to find my worth and my value in all of these things, and my educational achievements, in my standing within society, in the way that other people saw me as blameless. But now that I'm a Christian, what does he say? All those things are garbage. They are garbage compared to the way that I can know Jesus Christ. Do you see the readjustment? None of Paul's achievements before he was a Christian changed. His reality, his world didn't change. But the gospel transformed him in such a profound way that the way he saw himself and the world around him changed. That's how the gospel worked itself in Paul's life. The change was so profound that Paul began to see his life in a totally different way. Two things that I see. Number one, Paul saw himself differently, and Paul valued things in his life differently. He saw himself differently because instead of getting his worth from all these achievements, and hey, Paul had a lot, okay? Paul had a lot of achievement to find his value from. Instead of finding value from those things, he said, you know what? I'm valuable because of what Christ has done on the cross. And if I have value, it's because I'm a son of God, not because I passed with all A's in my seminary school. And his value structure changed. Before, what Paul valued the most was going after Christians and getting those heretics in jail and being zealous for the law and knowing the law better than anyone else did and following the law better than anyone else did. That's where Paul's value was. And yet after the gospel changed him, the way that Paul saw what he valued changed. Persecuting Christians, that was horrendous, unthinkable, a despicable mistake on his part, which is difficult. I love how Paul says here, where is it? Verse 8, he says, for his sake listen to this, I have suffered the loss of all things. That's rough. It's difficult for you to be 30 years old at the peak of your game, everyone telling you that you're acing it, at your incredible professional development, and then God come into your life and say, hey, Paul, you're off. You're totally off. You're not just a little bit off, like you're all off. You're chasing the wrong people. You're following the wrong God. You're following the wrong commandments. You're totally off. That's serious. That is suffering the loss of all things. And yet the transformation that had occurred in Paul's life because of the gospel was so profound that it had to impact the way that he saw his life. It had to impact the way that he spent his time, his money, his talents. Now, those 30 years that Paul spent, they were not wasted. God used that, okay? Paul's incredible intellect and his education were used for the advancement of the church. God redeems things, okay? We see that in the gospel too. But Paul was destroyed. So the question now before us is, so how is it that the gospel works itself into our life? We see how it worked itself in Paul's life. And this, Paul's life, right here in Philippians, is an example for how the gospel is supposed to work itself out in your life and in my life. That's what Paul is modeling for us, okay? He's modeling this for us. So the gospel provided a totally new reality for Paul to live in. The gospel was shouting a new truth, let's call it that, a new truth into every area of Paul's life. And the same is true for you and for me. As Christians, when we come to know God and know who He is, the gospel begins to transform us from the inside out. And because it transforms us from the inside out, it shapes the way that we see reality. That's the example that we see here in Paul. So, we might be here this morning, and these are some examples that might help. We might be here this morning thinking that, man, I have failed God in such an open way. I have failed God in such a miserable way. I had great opportunities. I came from a great family. I had things lined up for me, and I sinned. And I messed it up, and I was lazy, and I just stepped away from all that is. And so, to be honest, I'm just not sure God can use me. That might be our mentality. We might feel absolutely defeated. Like, not that God can't use me because He can do everything, right? But just that God won't use me. Because I've failed in such a miserable way that why would God use me? And yet when we look at the gospel, the way that the gospel defines that is by speaking truth into our life. And it tells us, yes, we might have failed God, and He might have given us great opportunities, but you know what? The game isn't over. And even if we're well advanced in years and we have wasted the most of our life, the gospel can still transform us. God can still transform us and use us in miraculous ways. Gospel speaks truth into our life. And we might be here this morning, and instead of feeling like we've really let God down, like we've really messed it up, we have serious consequences in our life and that God can't use us, we might feel the opposite. We might feel like we're doing a great job. We might feel like, let's be real, God's kind of lucky to have me. I mean, do you know how much I've studied? I've been in church for so long, and I have known the gospel so well. And to that, the gospel tells us what it told Paul, that we do not impress God. We don't impress God with our incredible actions or our great thoughts. God uses us despite the fact that we don't impress Him. I feel like for Paul, it must have been incredible for him to be so respected in every circle that he touched in his life. And yet, when the gospel came into his life, it cut him down to size. It grabbed the pride of Paul and it removed it. We have no pride before God. We do not impress God in the gospel. God impresses us in the gospel. We might be suffering through a lot of difficult hardships in life, whether it's health-related. Maybe the diagnosis came back from the doctor and it didn't look good. Or maybe we have a family member who's going through an incredibly difficult time in their spirituality, and they're far apart from God, and they're straying, and they're going in their own way, and nothing you say or do can change their heart. And we can be in that pit of despair or pit of pain. But you know what? The gospel speaks a new reality into that. The gospel tells us that even though there is pain and suffering, like there is pain and suffering in the gospel, there's no way to mask that. Jesus suffered heavily, but God worked something good through the gospel. And the suffering of Jesus Christ was not in vain. It was not wasted suffering, and God was working in the background. God was working in the background. You think if You and me were standing there on Calvary with Jesus on the cross, and we would have asked any spectator, hey, do you think Jesus, Son of God, do you think God's winning today? His son is getting nailed to a cross. You think God is winning today? You know what the response would have been? Yeah, probably no. His quarterback just got nailed to a tree. God's not winning today. And yet what we know from the gospel is that it might have seemed like a defeat, but the reality is that God used that as a victory. This means that our suffering is not wasted. God works in our life through those dark moments, through the pain. He works in our character. Our suffering is not wasted. That's what the gospel shows us. It gives us hope even in the darkest of times. We might feel like right now in our spirituality like our heart is far away from God. We're kind of just in church because we know that's what we should do, but our heart is cold. If we can be real, our heart is cold. We feel like there may not be any more hope for us as Christians. We try to read the Bible, nothing happens. We try to come on Sunday morning and sing, nothing happens. We try and meet with people on Friday night and try and pray and confess to God, and nothing happens. And we might be getting frustrated in our life. Well, what the gospel tells us is that no heart is too cold that God cannot change it. And if you came to Christ before, you can come to him again, and there's hope for us. There's redemption. There can be change in our life. You might be struggling this morning with an addiction, whether it's to pornography, maybe it's an addiction to alcohol, maybe you just have a really, really bad habit of relating to this one person that you feel like you can't break it. And it's been with you for years and years and years, and you feel absolutely and totally defeated. The gospel tells us that there is no defeat that Jesus Christ can overcome. And that addiction can be broken by the gospel. It can be broken. It takes perseverance. It takes discipline. But God has given us victory in the gospel. I think back to the humanist, I spoke about earlier, where he's doing his lecture thing, and he missed out on all this. He missed out on all this. For him, church was just a social club. It was a place where he came to get good morals and for his kids to make good friends that won't teach them the kids how to do bad things, and that's what church was for him. My hope is that church would not be that for us this morning. That we would not think that we grab all the great parts of Christianity, but we can leave the gospel out. That's not the way it works. If we buy into Christianity, if we're following Jesus Christ, if we believe the gospel, it means God wants to work in your life. And he will not leave you alone. He will not leave you alone. He will aim to work, and he's pushing to work, and he will press upon your heart to work and to change and to redeem, because that's what God does. And our instinct might be that whatever God is trying to mess with in our life is for the worse. He's trying to take away a good thing or change me so that I can be more religious, and it's not going to be fun and it's going to be terrible, but that's not what the gospel teaches us, is it? Was Paul a better person or a worse person after he was transformed by the gospel? He was a better person. He was a better person. But more importantly, his view of reality was totally out of whack until he came to know Jesus Christ, until he was transformed in the gospel, by the gospel. The same is true with us. We need to see the world the way that God sees the world, and we see that in the gospel. And we need to live and behave and chase after Jesus Christ with the example that we see in the gospel. I think that's the start of answering the question, how is it that the gospel works itself into our life? It's an important question because if we miss understanding how it is that Christianity has any practical implications in your life or in my life, we risk becoming a secular humanist who tried religion but didn't really find life in it, just kind of nice thing to do, but you can just have all those things without God. That's the lie that he believed. It's an important question to ask, and I think it's answered by looking at the gospel. In the gospel, we see things how God sees things, and we do things how God does them. The gospel is the foundation for our Christian life, and it's where we build our Christian life above. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, I thank you for your love. I thank you for the truth, the mercy, and the grace that we see in the gospel, Lord. Help us not to think of the gospel as something that just happens, that starts the Christian life, Father, and just kind of removes itself from real relevance from our life, God. That's not the case. The gospel is the foundation of what makes us Christian, God, and it is what continues providing for us a path forward, Lord. In the gospel, we see the world like you see it. Instead of valuing career, goals, opportunity, Father, we value Christ. We value who Jesus Christ is, what he's done on the cross, and we define ourselves the way that you define ourselves as a child of yours, God. I don't want our value structure to come from this world. I want our value structure to come from the gospel. God, what you find valuable, I want to find valuable. Show us, Father, the change in our hearts as Christians, the change in our hearts needs to show up in our life, God. And I pray also that you strengthen us to act, Father. The gospel gives us an example of what it means to be a Christian. It means to love. It means to sacrifice. It means to stand for truth. It means to show grace. It means to forgive. It means to fight for justice, Father. I pray for this, God. Open our eyes, God. Open our eyes to see the world that you see it, Father. You see it in the gospel, God, and give us strength to fight as Christians, to do things the way that you do them in the gospel, God. This is the circle. This is the big picture, Father, where Christianity finds its context, Lord. I pray for this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Guys, thanks for coming. We'll see you guys next week, and it's Mother's Day, so I just let you know, buy something so it doesn't catch you off guard.